Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are tackling something I think a lot of us get slightly wrong about how society actually works. Most people picture the justice system as this giant mechanical set of institutions that basically just acts upon a totally passive public, right? Police patrol, courts judge, corrections confine. But the reality on the ground is completely different. The justice system is actually a dynamic, living relationship with the community. And like any relationship, it can be healthy and trusting, or it can be suspicious and hostile. So we're going to explore the really fascinating concept of how public safety is actually created, or what we call co-produced, by communities and justice institutions working together. To see this in action, picture your own neighborhood for a second. Imagine two identical burglaries happen in two totally different neighborhoods. In the first neighborhood, a resident sees it, immediately calls it in, gives a clear description, and trusts that cooperating is actually going to make their block safer. In the second neighborhood, a resident sees the exact same crime, but they hesitate. They decide calling is only going to bring more trouble, so they stay silent. One crime gets solved, the other doesn't. Why? Because the difference in outcomes ultimately comes down to community trust, not just police presence. Okay, let's dive into the agenda. We'll start with Section 1, the co-production of safety. Then 2, culture, faith, and law. 3, diversity and equity. 4, procedural justice. And finally, 5, navigating conflict and crisis. Section 1, the co-production of safety.
Now, there is a crucial difference between raw legal power and what we actually call legitimacy. Sure, a regime can compel obedience through fear and force, but that kind of compliance completely collapses the second the threat weakens. Legitimacy is something else entirely. It's the public belief that an authority actually deserves to be obeyed. Think of it as the currency of voluntary cooperation. True safety actually depends on collective efficacy, basically neighbors looking out for each other and exercising informal social control. The formal justice system, it really only handles the tiny fraction of problems that informal control cannot.
And this brings us to what's known as the iron law of cooperation. The justice system literally just does not have the sheer numbers to force compliance on everyone. If a community completely withdraws its cooperation, if they stop reporting crimes, if they refuse to testify or resist instructions, the system is entirely overwhelmed. Safety is absolutely a co-authored project. Section 2, culture, faith, and law. This distinction is critical. We basically have two kinds of offenses. First, mala and se. These are acts that almost every single culture agrees are inherently evil, like murder or robbery. They command a massive, broad moral consensus. But then we have mala prohibida offenses. These are wrong simply because they are prohibited by statute, like, say, driving without a registration. The crucial takeaway here is that aggressively policing these mala prohibida offenses without genuine community consensus can heavily strain the legitimacy of the justice system, making it feel arbitrary rather than just. Now, when it comes to religion, the justice system has to perform a very careful constitutional balancing act. On one hand, you have the Establishment Clause, meaning the government absolutely cannot favor any religion. On the other hand, the Free Exercise Clause protects an individual's right to actually practice their faith. The system isn't taking theological sides here. It's maintaining a posture of neutral respect. And when that's done right, it allows for incredibly powerful faith-based partnerships, where religious organizations become these massive community assets, helping with things like reentry support and violence prevention. Section 3, diversity and equity. There is a really profound difference here between equality and equity, and the system has to adapt to this. Equality means giving everyone the exact same treatment, but equity means giving people what they actually need to reach a fair outcome. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept. Providing a legally binding English language form to everyone is equal treatment, for sure. But if a victim doesn't read English, well, it's not equitable. Equity requires providing an interpreter, so they have the exact same access to justice as an English speaker. We also need to impartially clarify another incredibly vital distinction. Disparity is simply a measured unequal outcome across groups. Discrimination, on the other hand, is differential treatment based on group membership. A disparity in arrest rates, just as an example, does not automatically prove deliberate discrimination. However, its root causes must always be investigated because unequal outcomes completely erode trust, regardless of intent. Which brings us to cumulative disadvantage. Think of the justice system as a sequence of decisions. A tiny, almost imperceptible disparity at that initial stop stage, it compounds, it feeds into who gets arrested, which feeds into who gets charged, all the way to conviction. By the very end of the process, these little micro disparities have snowballed into massive gaps. It's a compounding effect, much like interest on a loan, but we're talking about human lives.
Section 4. Procedural Justice.
To understand where we are today, we kind of have to look at how policing has evolved. Back in the 1800s political era, police were really close to neighborhoods, but corruption was totally rampant. Moving into the 1900s professional era, policing became highly standardized and consistent, but officers were suddenly confined to patrol cars, heavily distanced from the public. And now, in the 2000s community era, we are actively trying to bridge that gap and return to a focus on co-produced safety. The entire foundation of this community era is procedural justice. And this is a truly fascinating insight. People's judgment about the justice system actually depends less on whether they win or lose, and way more on whether they were treated fairly during the process. People will often accept a totally unfavorable outcome, like getting a speeding ticket, if the process leading up to it felt fundamentally fair and respectful. Procedural justice breaks down into 4 operational elements. Voice, giving people a genuine chance to tell their side. Neutrality, making impartial decisions based purely on facts. Respect, treating people with basic dignity. And trustworthiness, showing sincere concern for their well-being. And listen, these absolutely aren't just soft skills. This is the core, daily, operational discipline required to actually build legitimacy out on the street. When you combine that trust with a problem-solving mindset, you get the SORA model. Instead of just endlessly reacting to 911 calls at the exact same location over and over, problem-oriented policing scans for patterns, analyzes the root conditions, responds to the actual underlying issue in partnership with the community, and then assesses if it actually worked. Section 5. Navigating Conflict and Crisis. When major community conflicts erupt, they rarely just come out of nowhere. We have to separate the accumulated grievance from the flashpoint. The accumulated grievance is that long-standing, unaddressed feeling of unfair treatment simmering in a community. The flashpoint is simply the specific triggering incident. The flashpoint is merely the spark, but the accumulated grievance, that's the fuel. The most extreme stress test of trust is, without a doubt, the use of force. Legally, this is governed by the standard of objective reasonableness. The Supreme Court standard basically asks what a reasonable officer would do in that exact split-second moment, completely without the benefit of hindsight. But we do have to note, there is very often a gap between this legal minimum standard and what the community naturally expects regarding the preservation of life. We see this tension so intensely in mental health crises. In a rather surprising twist of history, when psychiatric hospitals were closed back in the 60s, community care just wasn't funded. This led to trans-institutionalization, where the justice system basically inherited mental health crises by default, and jails became de facto asylums. Today, modern policing is actively trying to reimagine this whole thing through co-response models, actually pairing officers directly with mental health clinicians. Imagine a scenario on a freeway overpass with a person in crisis. A traditional authoritative response, shouting commands, closing the distance, that's calibrated for someone who is actively choosing to resist, and it can so easily escalate into a tragedy. But a crisis intervention response is totally different. You stop at a distance, lower your voices, summon a clinician, and just buy time. Time is literally the most valuable resource here. Slowing down literally saves lives. And that is the absolute essence of de-escalation. It's both a philosophy and a tactical skill. It aims to reduce conflict intensity and treats force purely as a absolute last resort. De-escalation is the practical answer to preventing those flashpoints we discussed earlier. It perfectly ties together everything we've talked about regarding procedural justice and the true co-production of safety. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. For decades, the system has measured success by what is easy to count. Arrests made, citations written. But if safety is truly co-produced, is counting arrests really enough? If we want a justice system that actually works, we have to measure community trust, cooperation, and legitimacy. We absolutely must measure what actually matters to evaluate true justice. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning how we build a safer society together.